Welcome everyone to the SFHA webinar on the impact of social housing, economic, social, health and well-being. My name is Sally Thomas. I'm Chief Executive of the Scottish Federation of Housing Associations. I'm going to be introducing and chairing the session, which includes a presentation on the research, questions and answers from a really great panel, and doing our best to get some of your thoughts into the mix too. I want to start with a few contextual and introductory remarks. A home has never been more important. If we didn't know it before, we do now. Homes not only make lives, they save lives. During the pandemic, our homes have become more important than ever. They're the places that we're living in, studying in, educating our children, and keeping ourselves and our families safe and healthy. And we always knew that social housing does even more than that. It's not only a safe haven, but it reduces poverty, it improves health, it sustains rural communities, and it drives economic growth. And it helps the government meet its social policy objectives in other ways too, solving homelessness, equipping people with training and job opportunities, supporting an aging population, and reducing fuel poverty. And now here's the evidence. You're going to hear that today. The research you're going to hear has confirmed and improved what we already knew, that investment in social housing generates multiple and significant social and economic benefits for Scotland and its people. In short, social housing does what other housing providers can't or don't aspire to, not only providing a home, but making a real, tangible and long-term difference to the people who live there and the places they live in. The effects of this mean that the need for affordable housing will be greater than ever, both for Scotland's people and its economy. So this research couldn't have been more timely. We will need social housing to help rebuild our economy, create jobs, and reinvigorate our communities. Homes have been at the centre of the crisis, and they will be at the centre of the recovery, with social housing at the forefront, making the contribution it always has done to a fairer, more equal and inclusive Scotland. So first we're going to hear from Professor Ken Gibb from the UK Collaborative Centre for Housing Evidence, otherwise known as CASH, authors of the report, along with HACT, the Housing Association's charitable trust. Then we've got a great panel of research partners for a discussion and to answer your questions. But first of all, we're going to try and get your thoughts into the mix, as I said earlier. And we're going to have a poll which asks you to consider the three most important roles that social housing plays. So you're going to see a list on the screen, and you're going to be asked to choose no more than three of those points for an answer to the question. So away you go. And we should have some answers coming up fairly soon. It'll be really interesting to see, I mean, you know, social housing plays all those roles really importantly, but it'd be really interesting to see what people think are the three most important, if we can get some kind of majority view on any of it, or whether we're going to get some kind of fairly equal views. Will be interesting to see. Okay. So it provides more affordable homes, but also reduces poverty and inequality coming out equally, which is interesting and I think fantastic, because that is exactly where I think we are. We are social purpose organisations that provide great homes, and it's that social purpose bit that to me is more important almost than the home. So we provide homes as part of that social purpose mix and reducing poverty and inequality by doing that. So fantastic to see that as an outcome. Reducing homelessness is there alongside improving health and creating communities. Yeah, absolutely fundamental, and again reflects the partnership that has come together to create this research, and that you'll hear a bit more from later. But also the themes that have come out of the research, which Ken will talk about in a minute, and creating jobs. Yeah, kind of way down the list. And maybe I kind of think that's because we do a lot to get people in a better position to get jobs, you know, through training and financial inclusion and awareness, and help with the ways and means to get into the job market. But yeah, difficult for us to actually create the jobs that people need. But we're thinking more about there. So that's a great outcome, really interesting outcome overall. So thanks for doing that. I'm going to introduce Ken now, Professor Ken Gibb, who's Director of the UK Collaborative Centre for Housing Evidence. He's a Professor in Housing Economics and within the School of Social and Political Science. Most of you will know Ken. He's a well-Ken face on the scene in Scotland, and his research interests are focused on the economics, financial and policy dimensions of housing. So the perfect person to be doing this report and talking to you about it. His current interests are on the financing and economics of social and affordable housing, and the application of behavioural economics to housing. And he's carried out work for a whole range of organisations, government departments, Joseph Rowntree Foundation, trade bodies, and private sector and international organisations like the OECD, the Organisation for Economic Cooperative Development. So with no further ado, I'm going to hand over to you, Ken, to give us the presentation on the report.
Thank you very much, Sally, and good morning, everyone. I'm going to try and share a screen now and get this presentation going. Just bear with me. So yeah, so thanks very much, and it's great to be here and have a chance to finally, as it were, present this report and this research which we've been working on since the autumn last year. I am going to attempt to go through the highlights of this report. If you've had a chance to look at it, you know it's quite extensive and that there's a lot of material in it. I'm going to try and stick to the highlights, and I think to do that, I'm going to talk a little bit about how the project emerged, and have 5 kind of specific elements of the story, the sort of multi-dimensional nature of impact and what we mean by impact, some of the highlights of the kind of evidence review that we in HACT undertook, say a little bit about how impact relates to national public policy performance, which is one of our key messages, and then spend a little bit of time talking about case studies, and then finishing off briefly with some key takeaways. I should say that the research was a joint production of 4 authors, so myself, James Williams, Michael McLaughlin, and Louise Lawson. So James and Michael are on the panel, I think, and Louise should be in the audience. So we're all here one way or another. And of course, we're actually part of a much bigger team, both from HACT and CASH, who are involved in the research. Okay, so let's get started. The project was originally the idea of the Scottish Federation of Housing Associations, but over time, other partners emerged and became participants with us. The Rural and Islands Housing Association Forum, Public Health Scotland, and the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, and we're really, I think, really grateful for the efforts they made in working with us on the research. And I think the report is much better for their input, and we're very grateful for that. I hope they feel they've got as much out of it as we did. So as I say, the work was carried out, and it's really the first time that CASH and HACT have collaborated, or I trust not the last time. Started in autumn and really took up the kind of momentum in the new year, and of course that really coincided with COVID-19 and the lockdown, and that had a demonstrable material impact on their ability to do the work, as I'll talk about as we go along. So it was slightly delayed in being completed, and the case studies were directly impacted, but we still managed to do what we sought out to do. So there's really three main elements to the work. We have to kind of think a little bit about what we mean by impact and the measurement of impact. We've tried to assemble quite a complex multi-dimensional evidence review. We've carried out 4 case studies, and then we've tried to synthesize what we've found. And that's really the essence of the work that we've undertaken. So I'd like to start really by thinking about what we mean by impact and how one might define impact. So I would say that impact refers to the effects of interventions that may have direct, indirect, hidden, or unanticipated outcomes. And so impacts can be quite multidimensional, as we'll see shortly. And from a housing point of view, housing may have impacts through investment, it may have impacts through the operational activities of an organisation, and it may relate in some way to specific interventions or projects that the organisation carries forward. So we see impacts arising from economic dimensions, things like inclusive growth. We see impacts in the form of increasing affordable supply that might reduce inequalities, reduce poverty and homelessness, that it can improve health and well-being, but that extends into placemaking, community resilience, that to the extent that housing organisations are community anchors, that they're particularly well placed to support anti-poverty strategies. And there is at least the potential for these housing impacts to be preventative. That is, to reduce the requirement for other kinds of spending because they make a material difference to people and community lives. So these are really, in a sense, the topics that we're going to talk about in the report. The first kind of big theme that I wanted to address or to identify as we think important in this research is that there's a particularly important link between the potential impacts that social housing can have directly to the government's performance measurement of its national performance framework. In other words, the ambitions, the indicators of how well public policy is working in Scotland. And this has recently been refreshed by the Scottish Government, and it covers a whole range of issues like social justice, well-being, inclusive growth, and now also social justice and in particular sustainable development. And the idea that we are trying to suggest here is that this framework has a series of operational indicators, and that they in turn are reflected for areas like housing and regeneration, which has a kind of cluster of such indicators. And our argument really is that we can directly identify a number of economic and social health and well-being indicators that speak directly to the goals of the National Performance Framework. In other words, we think that well-measured impacts of housing activities can actually be shown to be, can be demonstrated to contribute directly to what the government's public policy aims and objectives are. And I'm sure you'll agree that's quite an important view to come to, or conclusion to come to. The next thing, the second kind of theme that follows on from that, I suppose, is that we think that if you can measure the value of social housing and you have a kind of set of measurement tools to do that, then you can actually have a much clearer impact and effect on demonstrating the quality of the work that's being done. So what kind of dimensions of this am I talking about? Well, you can deepen our understanding of the potential of the sector across these different dimensions. You, as an organisation, can also benefit from systematically monitoring and understanding your own communities, and we'll show that with the case studies in a few minutes. And of course, there are various tools, with all of which have benefits and all of which have some perhaps drawbacks, which measure impact. And the one that we have focused on with HACT is their UK Social Value Bank in particular, but also their community profiles. And these helpfully demonstrate the value of social impact to communities and for providers. And that allows organisations to have a series of benefits. One of those is a kind of instrumental benefit, in that if you're bidding for funds in a competition or you're seeking funds for investment, you can, if you measure these social impacts, you can enhance the case you're making, the argument you're making for funding. And of course, if you can link it to the National Performance Framework, so much the better. But it's also important because it allows you to assess the impact of your activities for your stakeholders, for your community, for your residents and your tenants. And it also allows you, in essence, to evaluate the quality of your intervention. So on the one hand, you're trying to make a stronger case before you get funding, and also you're able to, after the event, evaluate the impact that you have. So all these things seem to us, a priori, to be extremely valuable, and we will see evidence of these things being used. So turn now to the evidence review, and I've got a couple of slides on that. And first is a kind of infographic which sums up the economic kind of literature. So just to pull out a few of the points that are made here, I think it's well known that the housing construction, housing investment generates relatively large multipliers, and you can see them kind of multipliers that are suggested there of between 1.8 and 2. So these are large impacts on various dimensions of the economy. We see that from a 2016 study for Homes for Scotland, that if you were to provide an additional 10,000 homes, you have these benefits in terms of capital spend, full-time equivalents, jobs, extra tax revenue, etc. Well, some of those things are kind of transfer payments, but the output, the jobs, the capital spend are all very important, of course. And as a rule of thumb, somewhere between 4 and about 4.3, 4.4 jobs are created, FTEs per home built. So there's an important set of economic impacts. Also worth saying that the Ministry for Housing, Communities and Local Government in England, and as reported by Savills last year, they reckon that affordable housing is 50% additional. So it's additional to what the private sector could do. And in times of downturn and difficult economic circumstances, under certain conditions, that additionality can rise towards 100%, which is a striking fact in its own right. So I've said a lot already about social impact, and my colleagues from HACT will no doubt talk about this more themselves later on in the session. But we draw on the idea of the social value bank, which is a way of trying to capture the contribution that housing improvements make to people's lives. And this is really a statistical exercise which tries to capture the change to well-being and to give it a monetary value, and that's generated statistically from large household surveys like Understanding Society and the like, and is a robust mechanism which is accepted by government as a way of trying to calculate these welfare changes. And so that's the essence of what they're trying to do. So these examples in the infographic there are examples of the kinds of indicators that the social value bank can generate and put a kind of capital sum on in terms of the benefits that are achieved. So I think it's quite well known, for instance, that mental health improvements in the form of lower anxiety, etc., have particularly large monetized well-being impacts. For instance, I just wanted to spend a minute to drawing on what some of the literature under the areas of social impacts, health and well-being, health improvements, and rural housing, what some of the key messages are, which I think are quite interesting. So there was a study done by Red Row Housing, which was trying to work out what the social value of its hypothetical new developments would be, and I think that's quite instructive, even though it's kind of private housing. It shows that housing size matters, is worth a lot of well-being, as it were. That good neighbourhood conditions, good neighbours are important. that safety is important. A former colleague of mine who's now in Australia, Andy Nygaard, did a nice study where he looked at the social value bank returns, as it were, to building 100 affordable units in Melbourne. And he also looked at some of the preventative benefits, and we'll talk a bit more about prevention later, but preventative benefits is the idea that by achieving household in need, putting them into good quality or affordable warmth, good affordable housing, etc., that you can reduce some of the other ills that would have happened, such as homelessness, such as justice costs, such as NHS costs, that there are savings in some way as a result of that. Although, as we say in the report, sometimes these are hard to actually make real. It's quite hard to cash in some of those savings, but nonetheless, it's useful to know that we are making those reductions hypothetically in other budgets and in a broad social policy heading. Andy raises a couple of very important points, which we should always bear in mind when we're doing this kind of work. One is that we make assumptions in doing this sort of analysis. One is that the people who would actually live in those houses which generate these benefits are those most in need. And secondly, that they might not have found another solution to their problems, what's called deadweight loss. And interestingly, HACT do use official calculations of deadweight loss when they do their analytical work to derive these measures of well-being. Turning to health, there's a number of studies of health and housing and the impact potentially on physical and mental health of better housing, of more affordable supply, etc. Studies which suggest that if you live in affordably heated, appropriately sized affordable housing, that may well improve health, lead to better social relationships. If you have affordable warmth, there's some evidence that may reduce absences from school and from work. The King's Fund have done work which suggests that decent, safe homes enhance well-being, they reduce the burden of ill health, and they generate savings for the NHS. There are other studies as well. And on the rural side, the evidence seems to suggest, there's not much evidence, but the evidence that there is does seem to suggest that you can with just a small number of additional units, as long as you can get over the barriers of land and infrastructure and such, that you can make significant differences to the resilience of local areas. But it's very important that any new housing operates within a context of the existing housing stock, having sufficient different types of housing for the whole life cycle, as it were. Okay, so that just gives you a flavour of some of the evidence that we reviewed and kind of how it builds to the narrative and story. I want to turn now to the 4 case studies that we carried out. And as I said, they were impacted on by lockdown. We had hoped to spend some time talking to tenants and residents of the 4 associations. That wasn't possible. And of course, many staff of the organisations were either furloughed or working from home, and some of the practicalities of undertaking the case studies were harder to achieve. But nonetheless, we started off with the idea that we should have a range of associations, an urban community-based one, a rural, predominantly rural one, specialist association, and a larger regional provider. And you'll see from here that we came up with Southside, Scottish Borders, Beeld, and Clyde Valley, and we're really grateful to all of the help that they provided in such difficult times. Let's talk about what we found, and this is the last kind of major part of what I want to talk about today. So we use the HACT Community Insights or community profiling, which includes hundreds, if not thousands, of indicators which apply to the geography of the organisations in question. And we were able to profile what was similar and what was different about them. Some of that's kind of obvious in a sense. Their demography will be different, the kind of level of qualifications will be different, car ownership will be different. We found that some had lower digital connectivity than others. We found that in other cases, as I say, qualifications differed quite a bit. But all 4 had more than 70% of their housing stock in council tax bands A to C of the relevant local authority. We can illustrate, we obviously profiled what the associations did, but we wanted to find out a bit about the kind of impacts of the kind of work they were doing, which went beyond simply being a housing manager, as it were. And table 5, which I'll just flick forward to, gives an example of the sorts of things that people were doing. So you can see there's welfare benefits advice, tenancy sustainment work, work on loneliness and social isolation, there's work on employment, quite a bit of work about trying to address poverty, address particular demographic issues like the transitions that people make into adulthood, and also that all 4 organisations were involved in some kind of business reorganisation of the fundamental model that they apply. So one of the lessons for this is that you can have 4 completely different types of housing association, but they all operate to some extent in the same context, and in other extents they operate in different contexts. So if you look at the report, you'll find that we have examined a number of case studies, a number of individual projects and case studies in a little more detail. There's a study of a transitions program that Scottish Borders did for 16 plus adolescents. And we were able to use the hacked social value bank methodology to actually evaluate the impact of that. We also looked at a holiday food program that Southside Housing Association undertake, and we were able to use, again, the social value bank to put some monetary values on the impact that has. We looked at Clyde Valley's homelessness partnership work, and we demonstrated that there is the potential to evaluate and measure those impacts. And we also finally looked at a volunteering program about loneliness and social isolation that Beagles run, and again showed that there's potential to measure the impact of these things. So the case studies were tremendously valuable for us, and perhaps the thing that perhaps this project or report will become best known for is this is just an excerpt of the table, but this table 6. So the idea with this sort of social value work, I guess, is that you look at a case study, in this case, one of the 4 case studies activities undertaken in its local context, and that facilitates a series of these projects and facilitate a series of outcomes, social, health and economic, and they enhance personal well-being in some way. And as we said earlier, all of that contributes to some of the National Performance Framework objectives and indicators for housing and regeneration, but also for communities and such like as well. And what we've done in the report is we've taken a number of the case study projects and we've looked at the connections between what the project's about, the kind of key community profile baseline indicators that we can collect from the community profiles, then link that to the relevant UK social value bank outcomes, and then move from that to both the relevant housing and regeneration performance indicators the government uses and also the national performance theme. So you can have a direct link through to look at the kind of context, the indicators, and how they speak directly to what government's trying to achieve in housing and for the National Performance Framework. And that, in a sense, is what this is all about. That is pulling those 4 strands together. So in that context, what are the main implications we think we found from the case studies? They have much in common, as I say, even though the local contexts differ. They are initiatives that they take which are very much within the housing space, and there are others which are quite well out of it, and the organisations seem to be perfectly capable of working in that sort of way across both types of initiative. And we think that the evidence from the case studies, even though it's not as far as we wanted to go, demonstrates the utility of trying to measure impact directly. And it also shows how you can link it directly to what the government is trying to achieve with public policy more broadly. There's a lot more in the report about the case studies, but I think that's the main important things that we wanted to stress. So this takes me to the final slide. What is it that we're taking away from this? I suppose the first 3 points are actually all connected together. We think that the economic and social case is strong, relatively speaking, for more new social and affordable housing, and complements the recent research on national affordable housing needs. But equally, we think there's a strong case for investment in the existing housing stock. That's particularly true of climate change issues and carbon emission reduction issues. And those things kind of combine together to make the third point. As Sally said at the outset, there's a central role potentially for social housing to play as an investment provider for housing in the economic recovery, but that's also about the kinds of opportunities for investment that arise in the existing stock. So IPPR recently published a very interesting report about developing a new industry for air source heat pumps, which could be used as a major retrofitting industry, which would generate a whole new skilling up of people who are obviously now much more at the risk of unemployment. Alongside those kinds of economic cases about the post-COVID recovery, as you might imagine from what I've been saying, we also think that there's tremendous value in trying to generate stronger, rigorous, consistent evidence, which can be about the impacts and the evaluation of the work that social housing providers are doing, and that we can directly relate that to the government's public policy ambitions. Also, however, finally, we think that the very fact that it's possible to embrace this and try to measure impact locally means that housing providers can develop strategies which really fit closely with the local needs and requirements of their communities. And that can be done in a bottom-up way, so that on a collaborative kind of basis, association can work out what are the best kind of indicators for them to use and how they should invest in data collection and things of that kind. But that offers great potential that can allow greater work to be done, more work to be done, and also to make a stronger case that social housing really does make an impact and make a difference. And I'll stop at that point. Thank you.
Thanks, Ken. That was great, and congratulations for managing to squeeze so much information into a very short space of time, given how much there is in the report. And hopefully everyone will have a chance to read that if they haven't done already. There's a lot of rich and detailed and really interesting information in there. We're going to have a panel discussion now. So there are already some questions in the question and answer facility, and please use that to ask the panel some questions. I'm going to just briefly introduce the panel, and to bring them to life, really, I'm going to kind of add in some personal detail about them, not too personal, don't worry, really about kind of sporting and health interests, because that's very much one of the themes of the report, is the health impact of social housing. So first off, we've got James Williams from the Housing Association Charitable Trust, who's head of social impact there. And was a key part of the writing of the report, the research of the report with Ken and his colleagues. Michael McLaughlin, who works for both Scottish Federation of Housing Associations and HACT, and he's the social insight lead. James, I should say, does lots of sport, running, cricket, golf, so a whole range. Michael is a big football fan. And he's run and played on amateur football teams for about 20 years, although latterly mostly sitting in front of the television. Henry Coyle from REHAF and the Scottish Borders Housing Association is Customer Services Director with SFHA and Treasurer at REHAF. and he loves his football again, and has been a huge Liverpool fan for more than 40 years, although doesn't want to talk about the result on Sunday, which bypasses me, really, not being a football fan, but I'm sure that means a lot to a lot of people in the audience. Deborah Hay from JRF is Scotland's Policy and Partnership Manager, and is a recent convert to wild swimming. Amazing. I've just seen so many pictures of people wild swimming, and I think it's great that, that everyone's doing it. Well, not everyone, but a lot of people are doing it. No wetsuit either, so even more amazing. And Katrina Reid works for Public Health Scotland as Health Improvement Manager, and she's passionate about improving health, obviously, day job, personal interest as well, and is on a roller derby team, which is just amazing, and is learning to paddleboard. So lots of healthy sporting interest there in the panel. So welcome to our panel, and as I say, quite a lot of, in fact, a lot of questions and answers, questions mounting up. So I'm going to go straight to them. Let's have a look first. Okay. I think there's one here for, I would say for James, actually. James, does the economic impact take into account the full lifestyle of the new home? For example, does it include routine and major repairs?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I think if I'm being completely honest there, I think that's more of a new build rather than something that includes the repairs, you know, over a period of time. But I think it's a good point that obviously the repairs can create economic benefits to the wider community, particularly with use of local contractors. So I'll be honest with you, though. I think I might just need to go and double check that for the particular reports that we cited there, and just to see if it did include the wider, longer term lifestyle of the home.
Okay, thanks, James. That's great. I'm going to direct this one to Katrina. Given the research shows clearly the relationship between health and well-being and social housing, how would you see this research informing decision-making on allocation resource, on preventative spend, and shifting resources that way, in terms of kind of the public health challenge and delivery?
Thanks, Sally. Yeah, I mean, that's a great question, and I spotted it coming in quite early on when Ken was giving his presentation. It's a huge question with lots in there, and I guess the easier answer is that that's a hard question. But I suppose that was one of the reasons why we wanted to participate in this research, was to celebrate we hope the research would celebrate the breadth of impacts that are achieved by housing associations within communities. And it was interesting in the poll, in terms of the 3 points that came up as the highest responses. I myself didn't tick the improving health outcome, because actually it's all the other bits that lead to the health improvement and tackling health inequalities. So yeah, the health bit is what we want to see coming from the place-based approaches, the community reach from the housing associations, their engagement with people who are vulnerable, and the support that they can offer in terms of welfare advice or digital connectivity, isolation, all those things. And it's this evidence base that now, I see huge opportunities for us using this to influence discussions, particularly at a national level. We've got huge opportunities in Housing to 2040. We're anticipating the route map later this year, and this is where we want to be influencing. The research does talk to the challenges around improving prevention, and there's a lot of challenge there, but one of the values we have in the research is the National Performance Framework and alignment of the case studies to that. And that, I think, is one of our biggest the biggest messages we want to be taking forward in terms of trying to influence nationally through policy development like Housing to 2040, but also through working with community planning partnerships, for example, in terms of the local decision-making structures. And it's yeah, it's those connections that we need to be maximising.
Yeah, no, great. I know that Public Health Scotland, in its new role, in its new remit, does take the broadest possible view of health and well-being, which is absolutely what we need, and not to be reductive and restrictive about how we interpret these things.
Yeah, absolutely.
Michael, I've got a question for you here. What does from your point of view, and knowing what you know about the research and being very deeply involved in it, what does it tell us about the activities which have the biggest impact on reducing poverty? Given this was as Katrina said, one of the main outcomes of the kind of mini poll we just did. And, in that sense, what things should housing associations be focusing on to make the biggest difference on reducing poverty?
Sure. So I think, as James mentioned, looking at the HAT Social Value Bank, what we're able to do is to attribute proxy valuations to the outcome of each intervention that housing associations do with their tenants. That kind of provides a valuation on the improvement that each intervention provides for each person in terms of their well-being. So what is important in terms of attacking poverty and inequality is about understanding each area. So I think, looking at some broad strokes, we can do that, but I think it's important that what Ken did really well across the case study organisations was look at the data sets that I think mentioned the community profile from Community Insight that allows us to look at what are the trends, what are the needs within areas. Looking at the Social Value Bank calculations, things like employability and homelessness, they kind of rate as the highest, but I think it's important to understand each area. Looking at available data and kind of consulting with the tenants in that area about what their level of need is and how best to approach that. I think an example that people often use in that is looking at areas with a high level of people of pension age and providing massive employability programs. That's not necessarily the support that's needed to approach. I think the SIMD stats provide so many different indicators of deprivation that it's about understanding what are the kind of key indicators of that. It's something that we've looked at internally as part of the SFHA impact team, looking at what are the key indicators across the sector, looking what the wider stakeholders feel, and the work that we've done has highlighted 4 main areas of that, and where we can really make a difference in tenancy support, environmental improvements, affordability, and through that health and wellbeing piece. So it's something that we're really key on, and actually today, later today, are delighted to be launching a social value toolkit that will enable SFHA members to practically measure and understand some of these interventions and the kind of support that they can then offer within these communities. So I think it's an important one, but it's about understanding the wider context before we can really have a deeper dive into kind of resource allocation and understanding what local partnerships are involved that are key to be able to kind of bring up some of these stats. So as I say, the toolkit will be available later today on SFHA's Innovation Hub, and if anyone's interested in finding out more or finding out how they can apply that to their organisation, we have a webinar on the 21st of October, which SFHA will give out details for, but I'll stick my email address in the chat. And certainly if we can look at ways in which we can provide some of this kind of directed support, we'd be happy to do that.
That's great, Michael. Thanks. Yeah, I was going to highlight the toolkit at the end, but thanks for doing that now. That's really helpful. Henry, a question for you. What do we know from the report, and maybe more generally, about the impacts of social housing on rural communities?
Thanks, Sally. Yes, the REHAF, the Rural and Islands Housing Associations Forum, was really keen that there was a specific rural aspect to this research project, and delighted to be able to be one of the case studies in that, just in order to be able to compare to other housing associations up and down the country in terms of services that were provided and the impact that they're having. I think we always knew that we were providing the same breadth of services as other areas, both in terms of core services like delivering new homes, maintaining existing homes and supporting tenants, but also this research goes in quite a bit to the wider rural stuff in terms of, you know, financial inclusion services, supporting vulnerable tenants, supporting care leavers, dealing with homelessness, assisting in that area. And it was really important to be able to reflect that rural housing associations and provide those same services, and do so sometimes in more difficult circumstances. So certainly infrastructure would be a bigger issue, transport and accessibility would be a bigger issue in rural areas, and the research identified that, you know, that we're providing those services within that context. Energy efficiency and affordable warmth obviously is a bigger issue in rural areas. And I think that the research then allows us, and the toolkit that Michael was talking about will allow us to be able to identify the work that we're doing in those areas, to be able to tackle the issues that we have that are specific to rural areas, but also then measure the impact of that. So to be able to qualify and quantify that kind of impact has been really useful, and will be one of the most exciting bits of the research project moving forward. Digital connectivity is something that obviously we picked up from this as well, that we knew about before, and that's going to be something that's specific to rural communities as well. So I think probably in terms of reducing those inequalities, tackling fuel poverty, tackling homelessness in rural areas, working in partnership in rural areas, is another bigger issue in terms of, you know, the availability of third sector partners and the services to be able to help to do that. But they're all really essential in terms of building resilient communities and great places. And the research will help us to be able to know where we need to target our resources and put forward that case for all housing associations, but rural housing associations in particular as well.
Great. Okay, now that's great, Henry. I mean, I think what's really coming through already is the extent to which the research kind of, you know, brings together what we already know, but in a very in a comprehensive way, but also in a very focused way, and in a very you know, kind of multidisciplinary way, but also importantly gives us the roadmap, if you like, to what we need to do with that information and what's going to make the biggest difference. And Deborah, I wanted to come back to you really on that same question that we had earlier about poverty. You know, so which I asked Michael actually, but I'm going to ask you, given your brief. You know, what does the research for you? What does the research most tell us, if you like, about how housing can have the biggest and more impact on reducing poverty? I mean, clearly, again, given the results of the poll and the interests of everyone attending this session, what things should housing associations be doing to make the biggest difference?
Yeah. I think the research is great, and as you said at the beginning, incredibly timely. And if I can just do that annoying thing when you ask people questions, they put your question to one side and say something else instead first. But before I forget, because I'm middle-aged, so I'll have forgotten if I don't say it now. So JRF had its annual State of the Nation report launch on Monday, and we were very fortunate to have the Cabinet Secretary for Finance come and talk. And I thought, do you know, all the work that you guys have been doing has really come to fruition, because we now have a Cabinet Secretary that said on the webinar that there was no other sort of policy area or no bigger investment that you could make that would help create jobs, reduce poverty, tackle climate change, develop local economies and help Scotland recover than building affordable and social housing to a very high quality. So if you've got the Cabinet Secretary for Finance, the person in charge of the purse strings, saying that you have made that argument, that they recognise that that is going to be a core part of their approach to building out of the recovery, I think that's phenomenal. And you can't just win that argument once, as you guys know. You have to keep that argument going. So one of the things I think the report does really powerfully is says there are a whole heap of areas that investment in social housing contributes to. One of them is reducing poverty. So we know that keeping rents low in the social housing sector has been a key part of keeping child poverty levels lower in Scotland than in the rest of the UK. And that's a sort of protective factor that we need to continue to sort of hold on to. So we need that longer term commitment from government and from other investors. So I think this report is great, and it makes that case very, very powerfully. In terms of specific things that sort of housing associations can do, there's a very sort of poverty answer, which is you need to support your tenants to increase their incomes, and you need to support them to reduce their costs. And housing providers are doing a lot of that good work at the moment, but there's probably more that we could do, or that we could do a bit more consistently. So one of the key things that we'll be looking at in terms of the investment that the government puts into the next affordable housing supply programme, for which this report provides lots of evidence, is making sure that the right balance is struck between being able to build your affordable homes, being able to retrofit your existing properties in a way that doesn't really drive up rents for people that we know are already struggling. So we know poverty rates are increasing a wee bit. So keeping rents low over the next programme is going to be really important. Helping people where it's appropriate, absolutely agree with Michael's comments earlier. It has to be relative to the sort of profile of tenants that you've got in your homes. But where appropriate, helping people access employment and helping people access better employment progression is going to be really important. Helping people maximise their incomes, whether that's pension credits, which are horribly underclaimed, or whether that is other sort of working age benefits. There's a huge demand and a huge return on investing in welfare rights, debt and money advice, which we know is incredibly important. And, you know, as I said, we have to keep saying this over and over again, don't we? But 10 years ago, the Marmot Review made very clear that people's socioeconomic advantages were directly related to their health advantages. So we know that there's a huge payoff there. I think there are other things that housing associations can do that many of you do extremely well already, but we need to make sure that you've got the resources and the time to continue to do that. So building good relationships with your tenants so that you know what the local profile looks like is incredibly important, and that helps people intervene early. So there's lots of ways that housing associations could behave in their own practice that I think would really support good outcomes for people. To be able to do that, you need to be able to link with other health and social care organisations in the sector. So there need to be other services and other supports to help you put your tenants in touch with the kinds of things that might help them. So increasing incomes, driving down costs. One final point, I guess, on that is whether there's more that housing associations and others could do to help sort of cluster costs for people. So in our report this year, we worked alongside an advisory group of people, which included tenants. And they said, you know, that the cost of utilities, the cost of digital, which has been mentioned already today, these costs of living are really sort of pinching their household budgets and creating a lot of pressure. So are there ways in which housing associations could cluster some of that for people or help people find the best deals? One of the sort of problems of COVID has been that people have been sort of locked into quite expensive deals. So it would be good if housing associations could help tenants reduce their costs in those other sort of not just rent related ways.
Yeah. And I think that's, I mean, absolutely about kind of pooling resources actually between housing organisations, because the bigger reach and scope and scale you've got and resource platform you've got to be able to kind of corral those cost issues, then the more impact you're going to have. Which brings us on, I think, to another question which I'm going to pose to Ken. And there's a question here about housing organisations have a unique reach into communities, and they do. In fact, it is probably the most unique. They are unique. They are the only organisations that do what they do. Provide an excellent platform for supporting people's health, care needs, financial inclusion, all the things we've talked about. What more do you think could be done, Ken, at a national kind of government level to support housing associations to play this role, or all these roles?
Thanks, Sally. So that's a helpful question because it kind of relates to another piece of work that I'm doing just now in England, which is about how housing associations can play as big a role as is desirable in employment and training, given the challenging times that we're entering into. And in that area as well, I think one of the striking things is this notion that social housing providers have got this long-term relationship with their tenants and specific communities. We might call that being an anchor. We might say it's just that as a housing manager, they play this role. They get to know people really well. They understand them, and they have an incentive to have a long-term relationship with people. So in that context, I was really disappointed that only 8% of people including myself, thought that jobs were as important in that context. But that's a good example of another sort of difficult, complex problem that if associations choose, they can make a really big contribution to. And there's evidence in England of big organisations and small organisations doing employability work for people who are a long way away from the labour market, through working in partnership with education and employment services and a whole range of things, through to actually in progress and helping people progress in work. And all of that, as to me, suggests more than anything is that government can help. They can help doing some small things to make the transition to work and such, and to improve the position of social tenants, I guess, or residents in communities. There's a number of small things which are not really willing to be countenanced by government, which is things like providing financial support through social security while people start work, while they go through the very beginning process of getting into work. That's not going to be very expensive, and it appears to be a really major barrier for people considering entering the labour market. But the thing that really struck me was that there are some failings in government, and failings is too strong a word, but it's the sense that different parts of government operate at different spatial scales when they organise and they commission services and things like that. And that doesn't necessarily fit with the requirements for the communities themselves. So in the example of the labour market, a lot of DWP commissioning for some of its employment services operates at a really large spatial scale, and it's really hard for housing providers to get involved in that. Unless it's London or Manchester or something like that. Whereas if the provision of services and the role of the other partners, and indeed the housing providers, operated at a kind of functional labour market area, they'd all be able to actually probably perform much more effectively. So it's really just a plea, in a sense, and it's just one example, but a plea for more joined up thinking about how the different parts of government and governance operate together to have the best outcome for the people that they're trying to level up, as it were. And I think so. It's not just about resource. It's about the way that we organise and deliver things, I think.
Muted. I'll mute myself. Thanks for that. Thanks for that, Ken. I'm going to start to wind up, given that we are unfortunately nearing the time that we have to complete this session. There's a lot more questions which I'd love to be able to put to people, but we're going to run out of time if I do. I think what I'm going to do is just ask the panel finally, one by one, where they put their vote in the initial poll. Katrina's told us already, and we might guess where other members of the panel, knowing where they're coming from, might have put theirs. But just very quickly, I'm going to go around all of you, and just as quick as you can, where did you put your vote and why, but really briefly. Michael.
Sorry, again, muted. I put it on reducing poverty. And I think pretty much for the answer that I gave earlier on, I think it really aligns with not only the need in each community, but the kind of national performance indicators. So I think that's it's something that we not only do make a difference, but I think we can, as spoken earlier on about, we can make a bigger difference in that and kind of make bigger strides going forward.
Okay, thanks, Michael. James.
Thanks, Sally. Just the same. It's reducing poverty. That's why I enjoy working in social housing. It's something that I think connects well to the social housing sector, and my work in general tries to emphasise the importance of how information can help organisations reduce poverty and connect to their social purpose. So yeah, it was reducing poverty.
Okay, thanks. Katrina?
Thanks, Sally. I said reducing poverty, creating communities, and increasing the supply of affordable housing. For all the reasons I said before, it's the biggest place where we're going to make the impact for health, in particular health inequalities. We don't know what the impact of the pandemic is going to be, and actually we've got a lot more to come in terms of the economic recession that is en route, and there's much more that we need to be doing from a health perspective in these areas. Okay,
thanks a lot. Henry?
Well, I think Ken mentioned earlier on that timing of the research was quite difficult in that obviously lockdown and COVID came, but actually I think there's been a lot of lessons learned in terms of what the services we've delivered through lockdown have been, and a lot of people saying, you know, I didn't realise you did that. I thought you were only interested in the rent. Didn't realise you were interested in our health and well-being and our mental health and affordability and things like that. So I think, you know, the lessons learned from it will move more towards you know, a new business as usual, and I think probably that will, you know, for me is why I'd said reducing poverty, tackling poverty, reducing inequality, and creating communities, giving people the choice to use our services that want to use our services, and I think that would be really useful if it comes out of this too.
Okay, thank you, Deborah.
I did reducing poverty, no surprise there. High quality community, I think that's a really important part of what it is. It's not just housing, it's places. And like Ken, I picked jobs because actually we need not only to make a transition to a different kind of economy, but it needs to be a well-being one, it needs to be a green one. And I see social housing and the role that it can play very firmly in providing people with good quality jobs as part of that just transition. So I thought that's really important.
Great, thank you. And Ken, finally.
Well, actually, the one I went for automatically first was additional affordable supply, on the basis that I saw that as a very direct way to address or you know, contribute to addressing some of the other issues. And I would include within that the existing housing stock investment in it for the reasons I mentioned earlier. And I also went to enabling communities as well.
Thanks a lot for that. Well, I'm sorry we haven't got more time, because we could have gone on a lot longer given the questions that we had and given the conversation that we're having and the importance of this subject. But I'm going to thank all our panel for their participation and contribution. Thank you, Ken, for the presentation. And I want to also thank the 4 case study SFHA member organisations, Southside Housing Association, Clyde Valley Housing Association, Scottish Borders, and Build Housing and Care. And then just to just re-emphasise or just talk again about the toolkit that Michael mentioned. Michael's put his email address in the chat, but get hold of that toolkit, because it will help you, everyone out there, measure your impact in a long-term, sustainable, proportionate, realistic, and achievable way, without it being cumbersome and overburdensome, and lead to better decision making. And finally, thank you to all the partners who are represented on the panel, to Ken, to Housing Association Charitable Trust, HACT, which James represents, Public Health Scotland, Katrina, JRF, Deborah, and Rural and Islands Housing Association Forum, Henry, and Michael, who straddles both SFHA and HACT very effectively and has done some great work in this project, as everybody has. So thanks a lot for that. Thanks for everyone to attending, and hope you've enjoyed it, and see you again soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you.